Okay, 9 o'clock. Let's get this show on the road. Good morning, everybody. My name is Peter Churchill. If you're on Twitter, you'll find me as British Boy in DC. That's a bit misleading since I actually live in San Diego, but we'll let that go. Thank you for starting off your Dreamforce with the ConnectAPI. I am a Salesforce MVP. I do most of my work with nonprofits, but I also do app exchange development for a company called Know who do advocacy solutions. So I have a broad experience on the platform. I've been doing Salesforce development for about 10 years now. I think maybe I'm the first person to show you the glorious safe harbor statement. Salesforce is a public traded company. All purchasing decisions should be made based on current functionality. Today we'll be talking about pretty much everything that's in Winter 15, so there'll be no talk of future stuff. Everything will be available to you now. So what is the ConnectAPI? Well, the ConnectAPI is a namespace providing classes for accessing the same functionality as the Chatter REST API. But that's an important point. Often you'll see people say, you can only do the things you see today via the Chatter REST API. One of my goals is to explain that you can do all this in the regular Apex system. You don't need to be making callouts via the Chatter REST API. It is also known as Chatter and Apex in the documentation when you search around for it. And the ConnectAPI exposes Chatter data in a simpler way. And I bold simpler because that is not always a word people associate with the ConnectAPI. It can be challenging. My goal is to show you that there is perhaps a steeper learning curve than more typical Apex. But once you understand the building blocks behind it, that it works in a very similar way, and you can access a whole array of functionality with a few lines of code. A question you often see is, can I just do this in regular Apex? And you can still just insert into the feed item object, but you're pretty limited in what you can do. You can do like a simple text post, simple link, that's about it. If you want to do something like this, where you've got text, you've got an app mention, you've got links, you want to add attachments, and you want to add richer functionality, you need to tap into the ConnectAPI. So what are those other use cases for the ConnectAPI? Well, the key one there, creating a post with rich text, especially the app mention piece. That's a question you see a lot, and we're going to go through that today. If I want to attach a file to a post, share an existing file with a post, they're all things the ConnectAPI allows us to do. Now, new in Winter 15, which is a nice addition, we can now post in batch. So we're not going to hit some of those DML limits that were a previous potential challenge. We can search and display for results. So we can search those Chatter feeds, get back a set of results, and display them on a page. And these are the areas we're going to cover off today, because if we can get through these and you understand how to do some of these tasks, you'll find that everything else in the ConnectAPI, when you're looking at the documentation, makes a lot more sense. But it is worth talking about some key differences. So often when we're using like a more typical Apex scenario, we can have system mode or the context user mode. That doesn't exist in Chatter. Everything is in the context user. There is no system mode like you might see in triggers. So methods can only access what the current user can access. There's no sort of system run as. An example where you might see this is like if you're using the guest user on a force.com site, it can't write to Chatter. You can't override that. There's no way of getting around it. In the same way, therefore, there's no sharing or without sharing. So you can't say, ignore the sharing rules and I'll just write to a private Chatter group. All security, all that visibility that you typically use, it's based on the current user, and when that executes, it's going to be, does the user have access to that private group? No, then you can't do anything with it. And that I think is a key first point to take away, is that it's all about the current context user. Okay, so really the key to the ConnectAPI is input and output classes. And we're going to spend a lot of time understanding how they work, how we therefore construct some of these posts, and how all those classes have to be threaded together to build ultimately the inputs and outputs you want to get. So again, this is based on Winter 15. Winter 15 changed things a bit. So if you're looking at documentation or you're looking at examples through searches, they're going to look a bit different. It used to be up to now that feed item was kind of top of the tree. now in the ConnectAPI, feed element is at the top of the tree. And everything is going to come off that. Feed element has a type. There's a generic feed element type. But there's also one other type, which is the feed item, and that's what we're going to really focus on more today. And a feed item has a property, as the body. But here's where we start seeing differences from where if you were typically in Apex, if you're going to create an opportunity, you'd say new opportunity, and then you'd set the name, you'd set the date, insert, job done. The body of a ConnectAPI on the feed item property is in itself a set of classes. It's an input class. It's actually an array of classes. And into that message segments array, we're going to put another set of instances of different classes, and they're going to be subclasses of the message segment class. So as we go through, you'll see that it's not just a question of setting a property and inserting it. We have to build up our ConnectAPI input in such a way that it will then create those posts. Again, new in Winter 15 is the concept of capabilities. We now have this whole series of capabilities that have been added, and they all sit as part of different capability inputs. We have content attachments, we have comments, we can have links, bookmarks, and with my super duper lightning symbol, there are many different capabilities now. And typically, when you're trying to then, as you look through the documentation, you're going to see that you're going to find what you want to do, and it's going to be a capability if you want to bookmark something or any of those. And that's kind of what you're going to be looking at. But then within some of these areas, like comments, we can then go further down. So now we can go into an array of comments, which is a comment page. And a comment page is made up of a series of items. Each item is a comment. Each item has a body. Each item, that body is made up of message segments. So you can see how, we say simplified feed element, but to get to a post, there's a lot of different elements moving on. And that's, I think, where people, when they first come to the ConnectAPI, can get a little overwhelmed because they're used to just kind of setting a couple of properties and moving on. You need to kind of build it up from the bottom up until you can actually post that feed item into the shadow post. So I'm going to look at message segments first, because I think that's a great place to understand kind of how you build up these posts and eventually insert them into the system. So we're going to create this post. So pretty typical post, but actually behind the scenes, it's a set of message segments, a text segment, a mention segment, another text segment, a link segment, and so on. Each of those message segments, we have to create them individually, put them into an array, and then that's what actually is creating the post. So we talked about the feed item has a body. The body has a property, and its property is the message input. So we're going to create an input. The input in itself then has the second property, message segments. Segments is a list of ConnectAPI message segment inputs. And we have to declare that. And again, I've seen on places like Stack Exchange where people are trying to write code and they're like, well, this isn't working. It's because actually you have to explicitly start creating all of these input classes and populating them. So then we're going to create the first part of that, which was the text just hey. So literally we put that in, but notice we do message input, message segments add, our text segment input. And here's another key part of the ConnectAPI that people, I think, if they come out of other parts of Apex get confused about. Message segment input is an abstract class. So you need to set that property or add elements into that array, but you're going to create the subclasses of that. So we're going to create a text segment input, and text segment input has a property called text. But the next one we're going to create is a mention segment. And notice the mention segment has a totally different property, as an ID property. The ID property is the user you want to do the app mention for. And now we create another text segment input. So now, and notice we're just basically adding each message segment input. We set the property on it that we need, and we add it into the message segment input array. And we just keep doing that through all the segments that we need until we get to the final post. So now we've kind of created the the individual bits that we want to create and insert into that post, we now need to create the actual feed item input. So we create a feed item input. Again, we're declaring an instance of that class. We talked about the input has a body, and that body property is the message input that we just created on the previous slide. So we create the message input, we add all the segments into it, and then we're going to set that array into the input body. And notice the input subject ID. So that could be the ID of a record, or it can be the ID of a user. And that's kind of what's going to determine where or which chatter feed that is posted on. And finally, at the bottom is where we actually finally get to post that into the chatter feed. So it's a static method, but it's taking an instance of a class. So the ConnectAPI.chatterFeeds.postFeedElement. And one other thing I want to point out, because this is another place that in the ConnectAPI, I think people come a bit confused. Notice that the method is taking feed element input. But at the top of the screen, we created a feed item input. So in the documentation, and the method is requiring actually an abstract class. It's asking for an abstract feed element input as an abstract class. You can't create that. You have to create a concrete instance. In this case, feed item input is the concrete version of that. But I think sometimes people see the documentation and think, well, how do I create this mysterious class? It won't let me do it. Well, the point is you have to find the concrete version, the subclass that's going to let you do that. So what it actually looks like at the bottom, ConnectAPI, post feed element, and we're going to post the instance of feed item input called input that we set the message segments as the body of. We set binary input to null, and the community ID, if you're just posting into your lot of internal org, that's typically going to be null. If you're using communities, that's where you would set the community ID. Now, if that seems like a lot of work just to do a chatter post, you would be right. And so myself and some of the other MVPs talked with the chatter team, and they built a helper library specifically to make the app mentions piece, because that's often what people really want to use. It's available on GitHub, and just remember all these slides will be available after Dreamforce, so, and I'll post all the individual links into the chatter feed. So we created a Connect library, a ConnectAPI library. And what that means is, when we were creating all those inputs, we've created a parser for each of the inputs. So you'll see how we take the text, and then we wrap the user ID for the mention in braces. We just put in the link. And I don't know, is Arthur Louis here? Thank you, Arthur. So you just thank him afterwards. So literally, to create that post we just talked about where we did all of the inputs, what we can do is we can just kind of start concatenating these strings together. And now you'll see at the bottom, looks very similar, but we're using ConnectAPI helper, post feed item mentions. We pass in the subject ID, the user or the record. We pass in that text, and that helper class parses it out and achieves the same result. And that is something which I think, if you're working with a ConnectAPI a lot, I think you'll end up, and you'll see later on where we do the outputs, we do something similar. The helper libraries can make your life a lot easier, because there's probably a bunch of things you're repeating, and it's important to understand how to get to that result, because that's kind of typically how, if you use chatter answers, chatter questions, they all use a similar construct. You build up a bunch of input classes, you set properties, and you insert it. So once you've understood how to build that up, you can start building some of these helper libraries to really help you along. So quick recap on ConnectAPI input classes, because they are really key to understanding what we're trying to achieve. ConnectAPI methods often take arguments that are instances of ConnectAPI input classes. We saw that. We were posting a feed element. It was taking the feed item input. It was an instance of that class, even though it's a static method. Input classes are concrete unless marked abstract in the documentation. Concrete. It's just key to understand that it's all about finding the concrete version of those classes and creating them, creating instances of them. And that final piece we talked about, the methods often will require what looks like what is actually an abstract class, and you need to find the concrete child class of that in order to actually use it. And that can save you some pain from someone who didn't understand that always at the start. Okay, so we've done a post, we've done a nice rich text post, but the next part that people always want to do is they want to be able to use the see the attachment in the post. It's kind of always a key request on the ConnectAPI. Again, in Winter 15, that has changed a little bit. So again, if you see sample code for this, if it's not referencing Winter 15 and you're trying to use API version 32, it won't work. So again, feed element is now at the top of the tree. We have the feed item input, the body, the message segment, same as last time. But now in Winter 15, we have these new capabilities. And in the same way that we had to create instances of the message segments, now we have to create instances of these capability inputs, and that's how we can add content, so files, to these posts. We have two different scenarios. We'll see in the red the binary input. That means we want to add a new file that doesn't currently exist. Or we can share an existing file with this particular post. And we're going to see both of those in action in a little while. Same as last time, we create the feed item input. But now, remember we had input body, which was all of our message segments. Now we have another thing, input capabilities. Again, we need to create a new instance of it. We're going to create a new instance of the content, because remember, capabilities is kind of a wrapper for all of the content, bookmarks, comments, and everything else. So we create a new version of the content capability. And then in this case, we're just going to set the title, which is the title that will appear in the post. So we've done that, and that's going to be true whichever the two approaches we're taking with the files. But in the first case, where we want to take a new file and attach it, we need to create an instance of the binary input. It's going to take 3 parameters, a blob, which is the body, the content type, and the name. And you'll see in the sample, in the code we've got, we're just using like input file and uploading. But as long as you've got those 3 elements, you can create the binary input. And in our method to post it, you'll see we include the input. We had to create the input, the capabilities, and we had to create the title. But in this case, the third parameter now, we're actually going to include the instance of the binary input class as well as a parameter. We post that, it's going to do the chatter post, and it's going to have the attachment there as well. If, on the other hand, we already have the ID of a piece of content, either through a search or, for example, we'll see you insert a post with an attachment, you can get back the content ID that was created of that chatter file. In that case, on the capability, we just set input capability content, and we can set a property called content document ID, and just set that ID. And what will that have the effect of? It will make the attachment visible on the post, but actually it's just sharing the file with that post. It isn't creating a second version, which is why chatter files are kind of better than attachments at that level, because we have one file now shared with multiple records. We can just make it visible on that particular post. But the key thing to notice is in this case, when we're using an existing piece of content, we do not have to set the binary input. That is set to null in this case, because the actual file already exists in our system. Okay, so we talked about input, how to get a post in there. Now we want to talk about the other side. We want to talk about the output. So if we say do a search, and we want to put those results on the screen, what does that look like? Well, it looks fairly similar. Most ConnectAPI methods return instances of output classes. What does that mean? So when we do chatter feed post feed element, you're going to get back a ConnectAPI output class. So we can then reference that and use that in some way. All properties are read-only except created within test code. We will look at that. That can really confuse people, that you will see these, you will try and create these, and you'll not be able to. And then you think, well, how the hell do I test it then? Well, the point is you can do it, but only in a test context. All output classes are concrete unless marked abstract. Again, I just reinforce that the abstract concrete pieces are something which I think often in other areas of Apex you're not really ever exposed to, or you maybe use S-object, but that's about it. It's far more important to understand that here. And consider wrapper classes. You're going to see how I use a wrapper class on my outputs. I think wrapper classes on the outputs make life a lot easier. Otherwise, you just kind of have this like vast array of properties that you can access. It's sometimes easier to break that down in a wrapper class. Okay, so what is a feed element? So now, again, Winter 15, it's a bit different. At the top of the tree is the feed element page. The feed element page is a collection of elements, of feed elements. Within that collection, we have an element which is a feed element output. But now look, in other ways, it's the same. We have a body which has message segments. Those segments are made up of different types. So the output looks quite similar. But again, you've got to iterate through all of this. It's not as easy as just sort of pulling one property. You have to explicitly iterate through all these message segment inputs. Depending on, you can check the element, the type of the element. There's only really one core type now, the feed item. Otherwise, it's just generic. If there's a feed item as an actor, which is really the user who posted it. And now again, Winter 15, we have capabilities. If on an element, you can check to see, does the capability exist? If yes, then you can access it. So is content capability null? If not, there's content. And at that point, you can then access all of that information behind the content in terms of the image and the URL and all of that bits of information. And then same with comments. So if you do a search, you get back a post, you can then get back all the comments. The comments now gives you another collection, which is the comment page, each of which has items which have message segments, etc. So to do the output of a chatter feed can require quite a lot of iteration on the page to get through that. And that, again, is why sometimes it's easier to have a wrapper that kind of takes out certain elements so you can more directly access them. I, again, put my super lightning symbol because there are many capabilities. I think the last count there was 20, 25 capabilities, and I think it's clear from the release notes and from the documentation that's where everything is going to kind of exist moving forward. All right, so let's do a little demo so we can see what we're talking about. So we create up two custom objects, pretty simple. We have a project which has a feed, one-to-many project members, master detail, that has a field on it which is a lookup to user. So we have a project, and we're going to add the members. What do we want to do? Well, so if I add someone to my project, I want to alert them that they've been added to the project so they know it. So I'm going to do a simple app mention. And on that app mention, I'm going to include a link to a Visualforce page because I want them to upload their resume. Because I want to attach that to the project member feed, so I've got it if somebody asks me for it in a proposal. But if there it's on the project member record, because that's the place it should be, I also want to share that same file with the project feed. Then I'm just going to create some chatter data, because I want to show you the new Winter 15 bulk capability, because that's, in my mind, is a big step forward. And then we're going to have a little simple search page. So you click on a button, takes you to a page, and you can just search for the word resume, and it will bring back all the posts about resumes. Just a note as well on this code, it's all going to be available. It's all up on GitHub, so you can, so you'll be able to access all of the code along with some other samples in it, and see kind of how it all fits together. So we'll go to our project. We call this the DF14 live project. It has a simple start date. We're going to add a project member because we're good chatter folks. We're going to use a publisher action. We're going to add John Doe. We're going to add him in the role of project manager. He's 100% allocated to this project. So we create that, and behind the scenes, there's a simple trigger that has done two things. It's read that, and it's created this post for me. So it's done the app mention of John Doe, and it's created that link there. So if we go and look at the world as John Doe now, refresh his chatter feed. So now, this is turned up on his chatter feed. He sees he's been added to the project. He would get an email if that was his notification. However, it's just using all that chatter functionality to send it out to him. He's going to click on that link. This is just a simple Visualforce page using a typical input file. Input, we go to the desktop, upload his resume, and hit attach. And behind the scenes, that's done two things. It's attached it to this record, it's created the chatter file, but it has also, when we go to that file, notice it's shared with the project member record, which is this one, but it's also been shared with the project record. So back here on the project, we can see that John Doe's resume is posted on the project feed, but it's only one file that's been created and then shared with the project feed. All right, let's go back to me. So here now on the project feed, you'll see I just have a simple link that says create chatter data. What we want to see is you'll see right now, we launched the page, nothing's happened, it's just a custom publisher action on a Visualforce page. DML used, 0. I'm going to hit the button, it's just literally doing like a loop, 1 DML used. You think, okay, but when I refresh the feed, you're going to see that actually it's created, just as I say, it was a simple for loop that's created 50 entries in the feed, but I only have to use 1 DML statement. Prior to Winter 15, that would have used 1 per post, so that would have used 50 DML statements. So especially if you were dealing with triggers, life got a bit challenging. So that's why I just wanted to alert that that now exists, and that, you know, if you've done ConnectAPI stuff before, that'd be worth taking some time to go retrofit. So we've done that, so we have a bunch of data now, a bunch of noise as it were. And now we want to search the feed, so we can click here. And just notice that, just to sort of show the differences, we've now there's a custom page with just, you know, I think this has a standard bootstrap style behind it. As you can see, I'm not very good at design work. So we're going to put in just the word resume. We're going to do a search. And it's come back with references. Now, we can make that search cleverer, but it's come back with references. And in this case, notice a few things we talked about on the outputs that we could access for a feed item, the actor. The actor was John Doe because he was the person who actually inserted it into the feed. We can see demonstrating a chatter file, which was a title we created for it. And we can just either go to the link, or we're seeing the preview URL. And we can click on that, and it takes us straight to the document. So we'll just have a quick look at the code behind that. So I say all of this code is up on GitHub for you to use. This first one here is talking about the batch thing. So notice that pretty much from line all the way down there, that looks almost the same as any other feed element. It's no different. The only difference is that on line 28, we declare an instance of the batch input class. And again, so batch input is just an abstract class, and it's expecting, it's all to do with line 59. So line 59 says ConnectAPI.chatterFeeds post feed element batch. So whatever method you use, if you're posting feed elements, then you must use feed elements in the batch input. So those things have to match. So whatever you're choosing, whatever batch method you're using, it's going to expect you to be creating instances of the same class. Otherwise, it's going to throw you an error. And then just a couple of things to note on the input stuff, which we went through really, where you can see we're creating the inputs, and you can see in this line 32, we're using the document ID, and the document ID is from the class below where we inserted the chatter file. So we have 2 posts. First post, insert it, create the chatter file. That creates an instance of the output class. So now we can read the output class, navigate through to the content document, extract the ID, use it to share it. And that's how we're sharing it with the second post. And then just on the output demo, I just want to show you, so here you'll see line 33, feed item wrapper. So I've just created a simple wrapper where I pass in each of the feed elements that came out of that page, that came from the search, and then I'm just parsing certain things out. I'm looking for a content capability. I'm looking to see if there are comments, and then I keep those separately in that wrapper class. It just makes it a lot easier when you get to the page to try and navigate through that. Let's just quickly look at the page. So again, all of this code is up on GitHub, but I just want to point out on the page, you'll see that, say, line 52 there, what we're looking is in the wrapper class and then source CA. So we extracted the content explicitly and put it in its own property in the wrapper class. But notice, say, like on line 5960, we are looping through the message segments. Because if you want to get at that, so there is a property called text that you'll come across on body, which is just the text. But if you want to access the app mentions and the links and you want to parse them properly, you'll see how we're doing this. And you'll see there's a link in the slideshow to a nice little post, I think, by Perio, where they did this in an older version. So you have to kind of use some of the Winter 15 properties now, but it does a nice thing around the text segment mention segment. So it's kind of iterating through each message segment, working out, is it a text, in which case show the text. Is it a mention? Then I want to show like a link to the user ID so that you can navigate to it. So again, you want to make sure you've got all the richness of that post in terms of displaying the outputs as well as the inputs. You want to make sure you don't lose that when you're displaying it to the user, especially on a custom page. Okay. I want to just show one other thing, and then we're just going to talk about testing, and then we'll be wrapping up. One thing that can be confusing in the documentation is when they talk about testing, they talk about when you do searches, you can't just kind of build some test data and expect to find it in the search. You have to explicitly set it with what it says on line 20, set, test, search, feed elements. So you have to create a set of data and actually explicitly set that search, and that's the results you're going to get back off the search. What is not clear in the documentation always is that they just kind of create generic empty feed elements. But you can actually create, as you'll see in line 43, we create test elements. You can create those, insert those, add all sorts of data to those, and then when you get the search back, you can use that data. So it's not that you can't create and insert records into the chatter feed and find them in the search. It's just that you have to explicitly set them in that test method. All right, let us get back and just, as I say, talk briefly about testing. No? No? Why are we not doing this? Okay. Okay. So, one bit that may surprise you, for the most part with the ConnectAPI, you have to set C or data equals to true. I don't know if that's going to change at some point. It's not something I'm personally thrilled about, but you will often find because of just the nature of the ConnectAPI. Again, at Richard, all concrete output classes, you can only create these generic like feed element page, feed elements within test context. So if you try and do that outside of it, it won't work. But you can explicitly do that because that's the only way you can create that test data. And for searches, you've got to populate the feed first with specific test methods. You want to test a search, you've got to create 2 records, put it in the search, you're going to get back 2 records. And like if you create in the test data, you can create 4 records and insert them all. If you don't use if you don't use that specific method, they won't be there regardless of whether you've actually inserted them. So just to quickly go through how that looks. So we create a generic feed element page. We create a list of feed elements. And then, again, we can use a helper class, same theme. So in case we create a test element that's in the sample code, we create that, or we can just create empty generic ones. We add them into our T1, our list, our elements, and then we set the test search feed elements, and it's expecting to receive the feed element page at the top of the page, because a search returns a page, so you need to create that page in order for that search to work. A couple of other points before we finish off. Limits in ConnectAPI are a little different, although thankfully the biggest issue of the DML limit has kind of gone away to a degree. Bulk methods are now supported. There is also rate limiting. That's not something I've ever really hit, but you should be testing for that and catching that exception. It's a different exception that you'll see elsewhere. But when testing the code, the test starts a new rate limit. So if you're expecting to do a lot of volume, you need to be testing for that. Some chatter is asynchronous. That can be, you've probably seen it when you're using it, that you can create a post and it's just not immediately there because it's happening asynchronously in some cases. There is no XML support. Chatter is all about JSON. And there's no SOAP for the same on the same basis because it's very much built on top of the Chatter REST API. Links to docs, I'll post these in the feed afterwards, but so the code we've just done is up on my GitHub account, the helper class, and Arthur generously updated that for Winter 15, so that will now work with those. A couple of docs just to the general information on the ConnectAPI. There's also a link to that Apereo post I talked about, which is a nice overview of how to kind of get started on using the outputs to build up a pretty rich-looking page. And that is it. Where are we? We are at 9:36, so I guess we have about 5-10 minutes for questions. Yeah, do you want to use the microphone? Just so that it comes up on the audio afterwards.
I'm curious on when you're doing the app mentions in the post, can you app mention groups as well as people?
I believe so, yes. Is that true? Yeah. No, you can. So I think it's just, you're just basically, as long as it's a valid ID for the app mention. So anything you can app mention, as long as it's there and you use it right, then yeah, that'll work fine.
Can you reference CRM content files or just Chatter files?
You can, no, I think you can reference content files. Is that true? No, yes, you can reference content files in terms of, often the challenge is like getting at the right versions and stuff. So you're, depending on through the searches, that's worthy of an entirely different session, which would be files, content, attachments, trying to understand where they all come from. But Chatter files and content can reference each other. You can sometimes get into some challenges with, you have to make sure you explicitly enable the searches to bring back all that stuff, I think. Okay, I've stunned people into silence, which is always a good sign.
Can we also schedule a post at a particular time using ConnectAPI? Like we do it batch? Is there any mechanism to do that?
I mean, you could use the Apex scheduler. You talk about doing something like on a regular scheduled basis. I mean, there's nothing to stop you do that. Again, it's all going to be in the context of the user, though. So if you're running a scheduler, it's going to run in the context of whatever that scheduler user was set up. So if you're running it under an administrator, then the posts are going to be made in the name of that user. And that's kind of, that's one of the general challenges on that there is no impersonation in the ConnectAPI. So, which you can sort of do in regular Apex, where you can say you can set the created by ID. You can't do that in the ConnectAPI. So you would need to find a way to run that scheduler in the context of the user you actually wanted to post. So is that like one way I've done some of those things is I did integration with Twilio where I wanted to take the text message and publish it to a Chatter feed, and I wanted to do it in the context of user. What I actually ended up doing was inserting the record, like the Twilio SMS, into a custom object and passing that ID to a email service that I could then set to run in the context of the user I wanted it to work in. And that was kind of how I got around that impersonation. But that's a bit clunky, but that is one of those challenges when you talk about batch, scheduling, any of those things.
Okay. Thanks.
What kind of mechanisms are available for converting attachments over to Chatter files upon creation for like for Outlook, Salesforce Outlook connections and things like that?
I'm not really aware. I mean, to be honest, when I've done that, I've just written code to do it. I could certainly put up some code on GitHub where you can just kind of, you can read that. I'm not aware of any tools, because I've seen that asked before. I'm not aware of any tools to actually automate that process, sadly. All right, I think we will call it a day. I will be here at the front with any more questions in the next 5 minutes, but we will...
I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. It's basically scenario-based. I'll try to explain it a bit better way. I have a service which actually sends email to a set of users. And for those emails, I am creating certain attachments. And as soon as those emails are sent, we are creating chatter feeds.
Okay.
What's happening in this case that it's able to process bulk data for me. But when we have some 20 above records, it takes too long and then doesn't give any result to me. So I am wondering here that do we have some sort of heap size limitations over here? Any idea about that?
I mean, maybe it depends how big those attachments are, but are they particular? I would be surprised if it was a heap size limit. I think, are you creating like 20 different attachments, or you're creating one attachment that's shared between all 20 posts?
It's actually one attachment per email, but those attachments are not clumsy. I mean, they just contain some tabular data for some portal users traveling on the same day. So I am thinking that I have posted a case also with Salesforce, but I'm still looking forward to the solution. So.
Yeah, I would be surprised if that was a heap size limit, but yeah, without looking at it, I wouldn't be able to say offhand, but I would think that, I mean, if you're not using Winter 15 yet, then I would say the bulk option, because you can, I should have mentioned, you can bulk insert attachments through the bulk API, through the bulk post as well. So you can, as well as create like bulk feed element posts, you could also then, for each one you insert into the batch input, you can add an attachment into that. So in your case, you could create each, use the bulk input, create the feed element, create the attachment for that feed element, and then insert it in bulk. And I would think that would, of any option, that's probably be your best bet to fix that problem, because that's been optimized to do exactly what you're doing. So that would be probably my first port of call. You should be, depending on what instance you're on, Winter 15 will be going live in the next, either now or in the next week or two. I would try that out first, because that's specifically designed to try and fix that problem.
Okay, so you think bulk insert would help because it's asynchronous, will go on and will help us reduce the data size and all?
I've been told I have to finish up, so why don't we continue this conversation
sure.
offline.
Okay.
So if anyone wants to come and find me, do so. Sorry, thank you.